What's the scariest true story? Story 1. I am an eye doctor, and I had a patient who came to me with an infected eyelid that two other eye doctors had tried to treat but failed. They had been giving her all sorts of medicines and nothing worked. At this point, her eyelid was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement, despite being on many treatments. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, like that unsettling trick some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain why they avoided it. Anyhow, when I did it, I saw what looked like a visible mass inside the tissue with thick material. I thought I would give it a gentle nudge and saw it move. This was not an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It turned out to be a fly larva. The patient told me that a bug had hit her in the eye a few days before she developed this so-called infection. I removed the larva, and within 2 days the wound had closed, and she was completely recovered with just basic antibiotic eye drops. Story 2. The story of Jamie Kloss is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin, a 13-year-old girl went missing after her parents were killed in their home. Police arrived within 4 minutes, but she was gone. At first, there was speculation that she was kidnapped, that she might have been involved, or that she was dead. Nobody knew because she had completely vanished. 88 days later, in the middle of a northern Wisconsin winter, she ran into the street and found a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes away from her home. All of that is frightening enough, but here is the most disturbing part. She had never had any contact with the man who killed her family and abducted her. One day he was driving to a new job, one at which he only lasted a single day, and he saw her getting on the school bus. In that moment, he decided he was going to take her. There was no warning, no preparation, absolutely nothing she or her family could have done to prevent it. A disturbed young man saw her from 100 feet away and decided he would destroy her family and take her for himself. Story 3. The Franklin Expedition. About 150 British sailors and military personnel on two ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, two former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdy builds, departed British waters in the year 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did. The heavy weight of the ships, with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons, worked against them as much of the waters they crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The timing of the expedition coincided with one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, which meant the polar ice and especially the pack ice did not melt as usual. The ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the new process of canning, was purchased from the lowest bidder. Much of it was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning. Even the cans that were properly sealed were contaminated with lead from the soldering used to seal them. Combined with the lead pipes the men used for drinking water, the entire crews of both ships were slowly poisoned. Illnesses spread, including botulism, scurvy, and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, causing memory loss, paranoia, and mental deterioration. On top of that, tuberculosis had already killed some of the crew before they departed for the Arctic. After about 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge, John Franklin, and many others died in unknown circumstances. The remaining men decided to abandon the ships and try to hike to the nearest trading outpost at Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away. They loaded their rowboats with supplies, fixed them onto sleds, and tried to pull them. All the remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains were discovered by local Inuit tribes who described desolate campsites filled with skeletal corpses, half-built tents, and even human body parts in cooking pots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. Story 4. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside. It turned out those noises were people. They were trapped in a room that could not be broken open because water would have seeped in and drowned them, and they could not be brought out from the top because of the gases lingering there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of 3 men were found. The other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This meant they had been trapped for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved. They faced the fear of drowning in the tight compartment of the ship, and they had to endure the psychological torture of knowing death was coming. Story 5. A guy I was good friends with had a party one night and called to invite me over. It was my wife's and my first day off together in a while, and our daughter was 2 years old. I mentioned it to my wife, and my daughter said, "No, don't go, Daddy." Of course, I could not resist that, so I stayed home and we had a good night. My friend, however, had the worst night of his life. His party was going well, even though there was a friend of a friend there who no one really knew. It turned out the stranger had been using hallucinogens and suddenly became violent. He took a butcher knife and attacked 3 people, who all tragically lost their lives. My friend's wife threw their kids out of a 2-story window and jumped out herself, then took them into the woods and called the police. The police later found the attacker walking down the side of the road covered in blood and incoherent, saying he had no idea what he had done. What really hurts is that my friend was such a good guy. He looked tough, like a big biker, but was gentle, never mean to anyone, and always did the right thing. We worked together and became close from the very first day. He was always ready with a joke and a smile. Maybe not going to the party saved my life, or maybe I could have helped if I had been there. I still think about that even 20 years later. The fact that one unstable stranger destroyed the lives of 3 good families he did not even know still makes me angry. And I hope justice has never let him walk free. Story 6. This is not a frightening story, but it is eerie and always captured my imagination. One day a group of police trainees explored some of the catacombs under Paris. Many of them are completely unmapped. They entered an area and heard dogs barking and snarling. As they went further, they saw speakers mounted on the wall playing pre-recorded dog sounds and cameras watching them. They continued and eventually came into a huge opening where they found a cinema. It was lavishly decorated with projectors, a collection of old and new movies, working electricity, and even 3 phone lines. The police marked where they were and went back outside. The next day, they returned with more experienced officers to investigate further. Everything was gone. All the wiring had been ripped out. All the furniture was missing. The only thing that remained was a note that said, "Do not try to find us." As far as I know, they never figured out who had been there. Story 7. I used to work at a cave that was a tourist attraction. It was a very busy place. The tour guides used to tell visitors all the different ways that people had died in the cave. This script was changed in the late 1990s to make the tours more family-friendly, but needless to say, all of us employees still knew how many people had died there since the 1890s. It was always one of those things we joked about among ourselves. One evening after closing, some of the tour guides were messing with a brand new tour guide and told her to go sweep the cave. Since it was a cave, I thought this was the practical joke. Nope. They told her to make sure she got back into an area quite a distance from the entrance. Once they saw she was back there, they started swinging the extremely large, thick, bank vault-like door shut. They managed to close it while she was still running for the entrance. Then they turned off the cave lights from the outside. I told the guys to let her out quickly and not prolong the joke. We all heard faint screaming and banging on the vault door, and then it stopped. We quickly rushed to get the door open, flipped the lights on, but she was nowhere in sight. She was tucked away behind a corner, much farther from the entrance than we thought she could have made it in the dark. She was sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth with her arms wrapped around her knees, hyperventilating. After we got her somewhat calmed down, all she said was, "Someone grabbed me." She was never the same after that night. She had been a bubbly, outgoing person before, but afterwards she became quiet and standoffish. We could never get her to talk more about it, and she quit soon after. Story 8. I used to live and work in South Africa with a charity organization, and while there I became friends with a man originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was now in South Africa working with our group. Eventually I moved back to Canada, but we still kept in touch occasionally through Facebook. A couple of years went by, and he stopped updating his profile. It was sad, but people move on. And when you are halfway around the world, friendships can fade. A couple of years later, I was back in South Africa on holiday and asked some mutual friends if they knew where he was so that we could all meet up. Unfortunately, all they knew was that he had moved away around the time he stopped updating his profile, and no one knew where he ended up. Another friend and I decided to try to track him down. We eventually contacted his family in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo. They told us he had planned to go to Angola for a job opportunity, but they too had not heard from him in over a year. Sadly, I could not stay and continue the search, but my other friend did. He discovered that my friend had indeed made it to Luanda in Angola and was heading toward a town called Luau, near the Angola Democratic Republic of Congo border. However, that is where the trail went cold and he disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. Maybe he fell ill and died and was buried without anyone being notified. Maybe he fell victim to foul play. Maybe he got lost or injured in the vast wilderness. We will never know. We informed his family of what we found, and they were grateful, but they eventually accepted that he was likely gone. Unfortunately, this is the fate that can befall many itinerant workers, and in many developing regions, there are few resources or little will to make more than a brief search, if any at all. The point is, it is still possible for people to disappear even in this day and age. Usually, it is the less fortunate, itinerant people, or those in areas too remote or undeveloped to have proper safety nets. We rarely think about it until it affects us or someone we know, but it is not that difficult for a person to go missing and for loved ones to never know what happened. That is a frightening thought. Story 9. My mother works in hospice, which is basically where people are sent to pass away as comfortably as possible. There are many cancer patients and elderly people there. The scariest stories I know are when dying patients lose the right to make decisions about their own bodies. Sometimes it is because of Alzheimer's or dementia, which means it is often the children or grandchildren making the choices about their health. My mom did not work in hospice for long because a lot of families would selfishly keep their loved ones alive for as long as possible, and there is only so much morphine you can give without risking death, and the body is capable of producing an enormous amount of pain that medication cannot always fix. There is also a particularly cruel type of cancer that affects the pain centers of the brain. This is why many people advocate for compassionate death when someone is suffering from a terminal illness. Death is natural. Sometimes turning off the machines is the right thing to do, but when the next of kin cannot accept the idea of letting go, something that should have lasted a few days can be dragged out for years. These patients are not happy or enjoying their last moments. They are suffering. They beg for more medication when they have already reached the maximum dosage. Sometimes they even ask to die, but the staff cannot simply let nature take its course. This is my worst nightmare. I promised my mother that if she ever becomes that sick, I will not let that happen to her, and I intend to keep my word. Sometimes patients stop eating in an attempt to let go, but then nurses are forced to put a tube down their throats to keep them alive. In my opinion, that is torture. Story 10. The Fritzl case. A man named Josef Fritzl lived in a small town called Amstetten in Austria and faked the disappearance of his daughter Elizabeth. In reality, he kept her captive for 24 years in a hidden room in the basement of his house that he had built as a so-called nuclear shelter. During this time, he assaulted her many times and forced her to have several children who grew up locked in that room. When one of Elizabeth's babies died shortly after being born, he took the body and incinerated it. He would also punish them by cutting off the electricity or refusing to bring food. Fritzl wanted to raise some of the children with his wife, Elizabeth's mother, who had no idea what was happening in the basement. To cover it up, he forced Elizabeth to write fake letters, and then he pretended to find the babies abandoned on their porch. In 2008, when one of Elizabeth's oldest daughters, Kirsten, became seriously ill, Fritzl took her to a hospital. After a long discussion, he eventually let Elizabeth go see her daughter there. The police caught them at the hospital and interrogated them. Elizabeth told them her horrifying story, but only after they promised she would never have to see her father again. Story 11. Marine biologists took 3 alligator carcasses and dropped them 6,600 feet into the Gulf of Mexico. This is so deep that there is no natural light and no plants. Without plants, the ecosystem relies on marine snow, which is made of scraps of dead animals that sink from the surface. The ecosystem at that depth is mostly scavengers, with a few small predators. The first alligator was completely consumed in less than 24 hours by giant amphipods, deep-sea invertebrates the size of grapefruits. The second was consumed more slowly. After 51 days, only bones were left. Interestingly, scientists discovered a new species of bone-eating worm on its remains. The third carcass, however, is the one that gives me chills. When scientists sent their probe down to check it, the carcass was gone. Not a trace was left. There were drag marks on the seabed, and the ropes used to secure it had been torn apart, but otherwise it had vanished. At those depths, most animals are the size of a cat or smaller because food is so scarce. To be strong enough to tear through rope, carry away an 80-pound alligator, and disappear with it, whatever took it must have been much larger than anything known to live there. Some believe it could have been a shark, but sharks of that size are rarely found at such depths. To this day, no one knows what took that alligator. Story 12. The New London School explosion. In Texas in the year 1937, a school tried to tap into natural gas on its own, and the result was catastrophic. A leak caused an explosion that destroyed the school. This disaster is the reason natural gas is now scented in Texas and across the United States. I am amazed I never heard about this in school because it seems like something that should be taught. I read survivor stories and they gave me nightmares. Three in particular stuck with me. One was a 7 or 8-year-old girl who saw her best friend crushed by concrete. Only the girl's shoulders and head were above the rubble, and she still had a lollipop in her mouth as if she did not realize what had happened. Another was a 16 or 17-year-old boy who was helping dig people out. He saw a father holding his daughter and crying uncontrollably while the back of her head was shattered. The last was a 9-year-old girl who went looking for her mother after the explosion. There had been a PTA meeting, so many parents were present. Her mother was frantic, trying to find her, but did not even recognize her own child. The girl was so covered in blood, ash, and tears that when she approached her mother and called out, her mother insisted, "You're not my daughter." It was so horrifying that her own mother could not recognize her. This tragedy was one of the worst school disasters in history. Story 13. A neighbor shared this heartbreaking story with me. It is not terrifying in the traditional sense, but the sheer ordinariness of it makes it chilling. His sister, her husband, and their 2 children went camping in Washington every year. In May or early June of 2002 or 2003, they were at the lake. The son decided to use a rope swing to jump into the water. The family was watching, having fun, but the boy botched the jump and ended up with the rope tangled around his ankle. He fell badly, broke a bone, and was dragged underwater, flailing. His father immediately dove in to save him, but the water was shallow. He struck his head, was instantly paralyzed, and drowned. The mother panicked, jumped in to try to save both of them, but she suffered a heart attack and died as well. The son stopped struggling and just hung there in the water. The 10-year-old daughter, sitting safely on shore only minutes earlier, suddenly found herself watching her entire family die. It was devastating. She was later raised by my neighbor as his own daughter. I cannot even imagine what it must be like to experience something like that. How a series of small, mundane risks can turn lethal in less than 200 heartbeats. Story 14. This story is not the scariest, but it is one of the most disturbing family histories I have ever heard. Another woman had fallen in love with my great-grandfather, even though he was already married to my great-grandmother. One day she came to their home with a gun while he was at work. When my great-grandmother answered the door, she was shot point blank. My grandmother, only about 3 years old at the time, was standing behind her and witnessed everything. The woman, named Lorraine, decided not to harm the child, maybe thinking she would not remember or would not be believed, or simply because she could not bring herself to harm a little one. This was around 1930, when forensic investigation was limited, so no evidence was left and the case went cold. Life went on, and eventually Lorraine got what she wanted. She convinced my great-grandfather to marry her. She already had 2 children from a previous marriage, both older than my grandmother. No one ever talked about what happened to her first husband. My grandmother told people exactly who had murdered her mother, but no one believed her. Who would believe a grieving child who had lost her mother and now lived with a stepmother she disliked? Everyone assumed she was imagining things. Years passed. My grandmother grew up with her mother's killer in the same house, sleeping just rooms away. Lorraine knew that she knew and maintained a facade of being the perfect housewife, caring for the grieving father and child. But my grandmother was tormented. While Lorraine spoiled her own children, my grandmother was treated as the black sheep. Eventually, my grandmother moved out and married my grandfather at the first opportunity, eager to escape. Decades later, Lorraine became ill and lay on her deathbed. There she confessed to the truth, admitting everything she had done. 57 years had passed since the murder, and 16 years since my great-grandfather's death. He never knew. No official records were amended, and as far as I know, the case remains officially cold, almost 100 years later. What haunts me most is that my grandmother always knew. Even as an adult, people dismissed her, saying she had an overactive imagination as a child. To live with that knowledge for a lifetime, while no one believed her and her whole family stood against her, that is truly terrifying. Story 15. 215 unmarked graves of children were discovered at a residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. This is likely the beginning of many future discoveries as public pressure is building on the federal government and the church to fund and investigate the true extent of the brutality of the residential school system across the country. As someone born and raised in Canada, my knowledge of the residential school system, which operated up until the late 1960s, with the last school closing in the 1990s, was minimal. I only learned of its history as an adult, and even then, it was difficult to comprehend some of the first-hand stories told through articles and the Truth and Reconciliation investigations. This discovery, and the many more that will surely follow, will put these atrocities front and center for every Canadian and for people around the world to acknowledge. It will force us all to face a reality far darker than what survivors and their families had been able to make known in the past. Hopefully, truthful historic accounts will finally be written into the mainstream and integrated into our education system so everyone can understand, reflect, and ensure these stories are never forgotten. Story 16. This happened to one of my friends in Mumbai in the year 2017. She was a corporate executive, working long hours during the week and partying on weekends. She was easygoing and kind, living alone in an upscale neighborhood. One evening at a bar, a man approached her and offered her a drink. She accepted at first and chatted briefly, but when he began insisting they leave together, she refused. His persistence unsettled her, so she left with her friends. The next week, at the same bar, he appeared again and offered her a drink, which she declined. A week later, she tried a new bar across town and, to her shock, he showed up there too, repeating the same offer. She firmly told him to stop bothering her. For a while, she stopped seeing him and eventually forgot about it. She had a habit of hiding her apartment keys under the doormat to avoid losing them when she came home after drinking. One weekend, she returned home very intoxicated with a date. They went inside and began to relax together on her bed with dimmed lights. Her date reached for a condom from his wallet, but it slipped and fell to the floor. When he bent down to pick it up, he suddenly froze. Terrified, he insisted she follow him into the bathroom immediately. At first, she dismissed his reaction, thinking he was just drunk. But when he kept begging her to believe him and call the police, she finally agreed. They locked themselves in the bathroom and called the authorities. When the police arrived, they broke into the apartment. The couple explained the situation, and one officer ordered a search under the bed. What they found horrified her. It was the same man who had been offering her drinks at the bars. He was arrested on the spot. During interrogation, he confessed to stalking her for over a month. He knew where she kept her keys, her entire schedule, and even details about her friends. If not for her date's quick thinking, the stalker might have attacked her that night. It was chilling to realize how close she came to tragedy, and how someone could watch her so closely without her even knowing. Story 17. This is a personal story. When I was 10, I regularly attended a choir club for kids. One day my dad came to pick me up instead of my mom, which was unusual, but I did not think much of it until halfway through the drive. My dad began mumbling about how sorry he was and how I would never see him again. Frightened and confused, I kept asking what he meant, but he would not explain. When we reached home, he did not get out of the car, but urged me to go inside. Finally, he told me I would not see him again because he would soon be gone for what he had done, and that the police would explain it to me. After he practically pushed me out of the car, I rushed inside, but no one was home. The front door was open, and I found a puddle of blood on the floor. Soon the police arrived and explained what had happened. My dad, obsessively jealous, had found a pack of old condoms in the cupboard and decided that my mom must have been unfaithful. Never mind that we had only recently moved into that apartment and they could have been left by previous tenants, or that he controlled her every move and never let her go anywhere alone. The police took me to the hospital where my mom, still alive, was being treated. My dad had attacked her with a wine bottle, fracturing her skull. The only reason she survived was because my little brother, who was 7 at the time, intervened. If it had not been for him, my dad would have killed her. When my dad told me I would not see him again, he meant that he had planned to end his own life after dropping me off. He did not succeed, and the police placed him in a mental ward. This remains the scariest thing that has ever happened to me, but I keep thinking of my brother. What it must have been like to witness our father nearly kill our mom. We both suffered deep trauma from that night, but somehow grew up to be decent people. I never told him how grateful I am that he stepped in, but I really should. Story 18. The survival story of Jeffrey Prescott is one I found in an old book, the 1988 Reader's Digest, Facts and Fallacies. Prescott was hiking across the Mara Mountains with 2 companions, Noel Smith and Mick Yacht. While walking along the edge of an extinct volcano, Prescott slipped and fell an unknown distance into the crater. He lay unconscious as his companions trekked down to him. Realizing it would take at least a week to fetch help from the nearest village, they left him behind. Prescott knew he would not survive that long. With temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit and only a small amount of water, Prescott was certain he would die. To make matters worse, a small fire destroyed his medical supplies and food, forcing him to drag himself away from the flames. He survived there for 2 days and nights before dragging himself farther down the crater, hoping to find water. On the 4th morning around 10, he had returned unexpectedly with medical help. He had reached the village in only 3 days and returned immediately by horseback and jeep. Prescott was overjoyed and drank 2 quarts of water before being carried to a hospital. Doctors found he had a cracked skull, a broken wrist, several fractured vertebrae, and torn ligaments in his knee. Against all odds, he had survived long enough to be rescued. The experience inspired him to study nursing. As he put it, his miraculous survival convinced him to dedicate his life to helping others face and overcome death. Story 19. My ex-girlfriend once showed up at the house I was renting with a friend. She stood in the driveway, screaming insults and taunts. I had already been abused by her before, both verbally and physically, and we were terrified. We had smoked a little marijuana earlier, so we were not thinking clearly and did not call the police right away. The house was secluded, set in the hills with nearly an acre of land. We locked the doors and retreated upstairs to my room, hoping she would leave. This was before cell phones were common, and the cordless phone was downstairs. She went to the tool shed, grabbed a claw hammer, and started her rampage. First, she popped the hood of my car and destroyed the distributor cap and wires. Then she forced her way into the house through the sliding glass door. We heard her banging around downstairs before she headed up. The interior doors were solid oak, but that did not stop her. She alternated between crying, pleading, screaming insults, and hammering at the door. My friend, a cyclist, had left his bike downstairs. We came up with a desperate plan. I would distract her while he climbed out the window, dropped onto the overhang, and went down to re-enter the house quietly, grab his bike, and ride to the police station 2 miles away. The plan worked. She noticed him leaving, but not in time to stop him. Furious, she stormed around like an animal that had lost its prey. For reasons I still cannot understand, she eventually left, but not before driving into a dead-end cul-de-sac near the house. My friend returned with an officer who questioned us and surveyed the damage. We had the right to press charges, but my naive 20-year-old self just wanted her gone. The officer found her in the cul-de-sac and escorted her away. Later, I got a restraining order. To this day, the memory of her screaming, the pounding of the hammer, and the taunts she hurled through the door still haunt me. Story 20. The USS Indianapolis, the ship that delivered the atomic bomb to Hiroshima, suffered one of the worst naval disasters in history. After completing its top-secret mission, the ship was en route to its next training exercise, and because of the secrecy, had only a loose reporting schedule. Before it could check in, it was sunk by a Japanese submarine. About 1,200 men had been on board. Around 300 went down with the ship immediately, but the remaining 900 were left adrift in the Pacific Ocean, with no rescue expected for days. The survivors clung to life by forming circles to stay afloat. They smeared oil from the wreckage on their skin to block the sun, but the oil also irritated their skin. The days were brutally hot, causing dehydration, while the nights were so cold that men risked hypothermia. The salt water soaked through their flotation devices until they no longer worked. Exhausted men simply slipped beneath the waves. Sharks circled constantly, pulling men under or leaving them to vanish without a trace. Survivors later recalled talking to a buddy one moment, only to glance back and see him gone. Hallucinations and delusions set in as the days dragged on. Out of the 900 men who survived the sinking, only 316 were eventually rescued. The other 600 drowned or were taken by sharks. The ship's captain survived, but years later, haunted by guilt, he ended his life in the 1960s. Though he had no way of knowing or preventing the tragedy, he carried the weight of it until the end. Story 21. The police once blocked off a path, alleyways, a house, and a business near our workplace. They came into our building, interviewing everyone about suspicious people, vehicles, or behavior, but gave no details. The house belonged to a small business owner across the street. He was well known in the neighborhood, liked by most, and especially loved by local kids for fixing their bikes free of charge, giving them pocket money to help around, and always being friendly. It turned out he had taken his own life. Afterward, horrifying truths came out. He had been grooming boys for years. One victim blackmailed him repeatedly, and when another threatened to expose everything to the police, the man ended his life before the truth could fully surface. Investigators later tied him to one missing boy, with strong suspicions about two others going back years. It was chilling to learn that a man so trusted and seemingly harmless, a neighbor right on our doorstep, had lived a double life as a predator. Story 22. This is a personal story from my junior year of high school in San Antonio, Texas. At the time, I lived in an area known as the Medical Center, filled with hospitals, clinics, and schools. During that year, a series of assaults and robberies rocked the community. The attacker became known as the Medical Center Rapist. For almost a year, no one knew who he was. The crime stopped suddenly at the start of my senior year. I never thought much of it again, until a year after I graduated. My mom sent me a link to a news article and asked, "Do you know this kid?" I clicked and felt my stomach drop. The suspect they had arrested was a classmate from my second period Spanish class. He was 18 at the time of his arrest, but had been 16 and 17 when committing the crimes. I had spent a full school year sitting in the same classroom as him. He had a girlfriend, played on the basketball team, and seemed like any normal teenager. The most chilling thought was that he could have attacked my friends, my sister, or even my mom, and I would have never suspected it was the kid I saw every day in class. His arrest came only 2 days after he graduated high school, 1 year after I did. His trial lasted about 2 years. Meanwhile, many of his friends launched online protests claiming his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA samples, fingerprints, and victim identifications. Eventually, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. It still shocks me to this day. He had a good life, a girlfriend, friends, a family, and threw it away. It is frightening to realize there can be monsters sitting right beside you, blending in perfectly with everyone else. Story 23. A friend of mine had serious anger issues and other untreated mental problems. One night outside a bar, he got into a fight with his girlfriend. He smashed a beer bottle and stabbed her with it multiple times before running away. It was horrifying, looking out the window and seeing her being attacked, screaming in pain. Somehow she survived with mostly superficial wounds and told the police everything, including how unstable, violent, and psychotic he had become. He was never found at that point and went into hiding. She spent months recovering, traumatized and terrified he might return. She quit her job, developed an addiction to medication, and had a complete breakdown. Months later, he approached her on the street, begging for forgiveness and asking her to take him back. She ran away and called the police. They started searching for him again. Just 2 days later, he broke into her apartment and brutally attacked her with a baseball bat. Weeks later, he was found dead from suicide in the Upper West Side. The worst part was his mother, who kept insisting he was innocent and that someone else must have been responsible, even though the truth was undeniable. Story 24. Every year, Earth passes through a dangerous trail of comet debris known as the Beta Taurids. It is the same stream responsible for the Tunguska event in 1908, when a 650-foot chunk of comet exploded 15,000 feet above Siberia, flattening 800 square miles of forest. The Beta Taurids are a daytime meteor stream, with the meteors coming from the direction of the sun, making them almost impossible to detect with telescopes. Each year, we simply cross our fingers and hope nothing catastrophic happens. Most meteors in showers are tiny, the size of grains of rice. But in 2016, astronomers observed meteors more than 600 feet wide entering the atmosphere. Many believe we are now moving closer to the very heart of the Taurid stream, which is the debris left behind by Comet Encke. That comet was once 60 miles wide and has shrunk to 3 miles wide, scattering 57 miles of debris across the inner solar system. Some fragments as large as 15 kilometers are thought to still exist. In June 2032, Earth will pass through the densest part of this stream, and astronomers have publicly admitted that it is a cause for concern. It is also believed that the Beta Taurids may have caused the Younger Dryas impact event around 12,900 years ago. During that event, thousands of Tunguska-sized explosions devastated North America, wiping out megafauna like mammoths, short-faced bears, and giant sloths. The floods recorded in so many ancient religious texts may have originated from this catastrophe. The Hiawatha crater in Greenland, as well as the Great Lakes and Carolina Bays, may be remnants of that same impact. Story 25. When I was 13 or 14, my family went to the county fair on an extremely crowded day. We were in the section with kiddie rides, and my aunt and dad were arguing. Everyone was distracted trying to calm them down. Out of nowhere, my mom grabbed my hand tightly and said, "Follow me now." She rushed straight to an older man, probably in his 60s, who was holding the hand of a crying boy who looked about 5. My mom demanded, "What are you doing with him?" The man froze and claimed he was the boy's grandfather, and that they had simply lost the boy's mother. My mom knelt down and asked the boy, "Do you know this man?" The boy shook his head no and said he was looking for his mommy. My mom asked where he had last seen her, and the boy pointed at the man, saying, "He says she's in the parking lot." My stomach dropped. The man glared at the boy and quickly licked his lips in a way that made me feel sick. My mom grabbed the boy's hand and told him, "We'll help you find your mommy. She isn't in the parking lot. We're going to look where you last saw her and get a police officer to help, okay?" The boy was confused but agreed. My mom snapped at the man to let go, and he finally did, glaring at us. By the time we looked back after speaking to the boy, the man had disappeared into the crowd. We took the boy to a security officer who immediately radioed, "We found him." Moments later, a frantic woman carrying 2 toddlers ran toward us, sobbing. She hugged her son tightly, thanking my mother over and over. She explained she had let him ride alone and promised to wait at the exit. But one of her twins started crying, and in those few distracted moments, he was gone. It felt like something out of a movie. The police thanked my mom, and we returned to our worried family. My mom later explained that amidst the noise of the crowd and my aunt and dad shouting, she had heard a faint, "I want my mommy." Somehow, out of hundreds of people, she had spotted the boy and sensed something was wrong. We never went back to the fair after that day. The image of the man licking his lips still haunts me, and the fact that he got away still haunts my mom. Story 26. I have never shared this story before, though it still gives me nightmares. Maybe writing it out will finally help me let some of it go. About 30 years ago, right after college, I worked as a temp. Anyone who is temped knows the co-workers are a mixed group of people. One co-worker was a woman from another state. I will not share real names or places, so I will call her Grace. She was older and she was missing an eye. No prosthetic, just an empty socket. One day she confided in me that she had lost her eye during a carjacking in a large city. She said she had been shot 3 times and assaulted. She also told me her husband was in the military, overseas on combat duty, but would be retiring after his tour. Grace regularly sent him care packages of food and supplies. She had an adult daughter, but they were estranged, and she often urged me to call your mom. It means a lot. When her husband's military pay came in, she bought a brand new SUV, nicer than anything I could have afforded. I visited her home a couple of times. She had a parrot that would call out, "Where's Papa?" and go searching for her husband. Though she was a bit odd, I figured her life experiences explained it. Still, sometimes things she said unsettled me, and I would get a bad gut feeling. One day I was reading the news and saw an article about an inmate suing the state for maltreatment. The name struck me as familiar. Grace's husband's name. It was unusual, but I dismissed it. She later mentioned he would be home for leave around the holidays, and that seemed to ease my doubt. After the holidays, she said he had gone back overseas, though she was stressed that he might be forced to extend his service. She began giving me gifts, food and trinkets. I grew uneasy and started refusing them. I stopped visiting her house. By spring, I saw a follow-up about the inmate in the news. Curious, I looked up the court case. The man had received a six-figure settlement, but remained in prison. Reading further, I was horrified. He was a convicted rapist and child molester who had been imprisoned for over 20 years. His parole had been denied because he was considered dangerous and violent. The transcripts revealed even worse details. Years earlier, during a visitation, his girlfriend had brought in a child victim and enabled him to abuse her right there in the visitation room. He was caught, but she escaped charges. The child was taken away. I still had no proof this was Grace's husband, but the overlap of names and details terrified me. I had nightmares for weeks. At work, Grace grew more intense. One afternoon, she left for lunch and did not come back. The supervisors asked if I knew where she was. Later, she pulled up in her SUV and scolded me for not covering for her. She demanded I get in her car, yelling at me to ride with her. I refused. Back in the office, she sat down and whispered, "Why won't you ride with me? Why won't you come to my house? Something is wrong, I know it." I brushed it off. The supervisor soon called her in and let her go for falsifying information on her paperwork. When I asked if it was about her husband, they nodded but said no more. Later, I learned the truth. It was him. He was the one who had shot her, and despite everything, she remained loyal to him. I checked his status for years on the offender registry. Eventually, I saw he had been paroled. He was out there. Then one year, I saw his status updated to deceased. Grace's obituary appeared around the same time. I do not know how either of them died. I only hope their children, wherever they are okay. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if I had gotten into her car that day. Even then, I had read enough true crime to know some possibilities, and none of them were good. Story 27. The case of Daniel LaPlante has always been one of the most disturbing true crime stories. In 1987, at the age of 17, he assaulted and murdered a 33-year-old pregnant woman and then drowned her two young children in a bathtub. Their bodies were discovered by the husband and father when he came home from work. LaPlante was eventually caught and sentenced to prison, but this was not the first family he terrorized. In 1986, he became obsessed with a girl named Annie, whose mother had passed away from cancer. Annie lived with her sister and their father. LaPlante began stalking her, first by calling her home and pretending to be a neighborhood boy. Eventually, he convinced Annie to go on a date, but afterwards she realized she was not interested. He did not take the rejection well. Soon after, he broke into her house and discovered a crawl space where he lived in hiding for 2 months. During this time, Annie and her sister attempted to hold a seance to communicate with their late mother. That was when they began hearing tapping on the walls, which they initially thought was a spirit. The tapping grew more aggressive, furniture began moving, and strange writings appeared on the walls. Terrified, the girls told their father the house was haunted, but he dismissed it as grief. One night, the tapping led them to Annie's closet. On their way, they saw a new message scrawled on the wall. "I'm back. Find me if you can." They fled to a neighbor's house, and their father returned home to prove nothing was wrong. But inside, he discovered another chilling message. Suddenly, he heard a noise, turned, and saw Daniel LaPlante in the hallway. He was wearing a wig and one of his dead wife's dresses, and he was holding a hatchet. He tried to attack, but the father managed to escape and call the police. When officers searched the house, they discovered a small door in Annie's closet leading to the crawl space. Inside, they found LaPlante, who had been secretly living in the family's home. Story 28. Reading these stories reminds me of a close call my mom had when I was about 8 or 9 years old. I am 32 now. We lived in the bush in a small community, and my mom's boyfriend at the time often threw parties. People were always coming by for drinks or to hang out. One man in particular, whom I will call Chad, had a reputation for being strange. He was believed to be schizophrenic and lived even deeper in the woods than we did. Once, my mom stopped by his place and said it reeked of death. He had apparently been skinning animals and leaving their remains out in the sun. One day when my mom's boyfriend was away, Chad dropped by. My mom, being kind, invited him in. She chatted with him for hours while cleaning and baking until her boyfriend returned. Her boyfriend quickly pulled her aside and warned her never to invite Chad in when he was not home. A month or two later, one morning around 10, there was a knock at our door. Chad stood there anxious and fidgeting, asking if my mom was home. His hands were hidden behind his back. My mom's boyfriend answered, lied that she was not there, and told him to leave. Chad turned reluctantly, and that was when it was revealed what he had been holding behind his back, a large butcher knife. Thankfully, he left. But to this day, I shudder to think about what might have happened if my mom had been home alone or if her boyfriend had let him inside. Each time my mom brings up the story, I feel sick with fear at how close it came to something terrible. Story 29. This story happened to a friend, or so I was told, and I hope it was not a lie, because it haunted me for days. During a trip to Amsterdam, she was out clubbing and met a man she described as handsome, charming, and fun. Things escalated in the bathroom, where they kissed and were intimate, though they did not go all the way. He then invited her back to his place to continue. Excited, she ran to her friends to let them know she was leaving with him. One of her friends, thinking practically, told her to get his name and address first. She went back to the man and asked, but he became defensive. Her friend stepped in and suggested taking a picture, just to remember the first guy she was willing to follow home after just meeting. At that, the man cursed at them and stormed off. They were rattled by his reaction, but relieved she had avoided what could have been a dangerous situation. A few days later, back home, the girl began feeling unwell. Her throat worsened, so she went to her doctor. The doctor was alarmed, saying it did not look like a normal infection, and took a swab. When the results came back, they revealed bacteria only found on dead bodies. Police became involved and thoroughly investigated her, eventually ruling her out as a suspect. When asked about her recent encounters, she remembered the strange man in Amsterdam. She told the police everything. Weeks later, the man was arrested. Investigators found the remains of 5 women in his home, dismembered and violated. His method had been to charm women in clubs, lure them home, and then kill them. Without her friend's insistence on getting his information that night, she might have been his next victim. To this day, she still goes to therapy and struggles to rebuild her social life. Story 30. It was early spring, and farmers were preparing their fields for planting. They are allowed to obtain permits to burn debris, while residential lots are not. Every year, dispatch receives countless complaints, often neighbors calling in farmers who have permits, or residents reporting each other's backyard fires. On this particular sunny day, one property kept getting reported. It was next to a new development where people's backyards overlooked the farmers' fields. Neither of the 2 fire trucks nor the prevention crew considered it urgent. Farmers almost always had permits. After repeated calls, they finally decided to check it out, thinking their presence might stop the constant complaints. When they arrived, they saw a quad and the farmer across the field. As they approached, they shouted greetings but received no response. At first, they thought he could not hear them, but then realized something was wrong. He was kneeling, unmoving. When they got closer, they discovered the awful truth. The man had been badly burned. The farmer, more than 90 years old, had been burning long grass when he fell and could not get back up. The fire spread, trapping him where he knelt. His clothes caught fire, burning away most of his skin. Only his hat and hair remained untouched. Alone in the field, he endured unimaginable pain, waiting to be found. When the crew reached him, he was remarkably calm and kind despite his injuries, not even complaining when they moved him. He was taken to the hospital but died a few days later. My husband, one of the responders, said it was one of the hardest calls he ever attended, not only because of what they saw, but because the call had not come through dispatch as an emergency. They had not been prepared to find a victim. The lingering question of whether they might have saved him if they had arrived sooner still weighs heavily. Story 31. I once heard a story from my parents about a mother they knew who had just moved into a new housing development with her husband and their twin daughters, about 4 or 5 years old. The neighborhood was still half under construction. No trees, no fences, just dirt, saplings, and builders driving in and out of the area. One day, the twins were playing outside with a large cardboard box from their new refrigerator. Their mother was watching from the kitchen window to make sure they stayed in the yard and away from the busy construction across the street. Then a semi-trailer came down the road to deliver supplies to a neighboring house under construction. The driver mounted the curb directly in front of their yard and rolled right over the box, flattening it instantly. He assumed it was empty, but the girls were inside. The mother witnessed it happen from the window. The tragedy destroyed her family. Years later, she eventually started over with a new partner and family. But the story is a reminder that assumptions, even innocent ones, can shatter lives in an instant. Story 32. I had a friend I knew for a few years. We met online, but she lived nearby, so we stayed in touch. We flirted instead, even hooked up once. One night, I was supposed to pick her up to hang out at my place. Like usual, I flaked. That same night, her roommate strangled her to death after an argument. From what I heard, it was random. He just snapped. Maybe it would have happened another time, but I know that if I had followed through on our plans, she would have lived at least one more day. Another friend of mine had a similar fate. She was engaged to a man who had just proposed. We talked a lot, and she admitted he was intense and controlling, especially about her S-work. She was planning to leave that life behind now that she was engaged, and just the day before it happened, she told me how unexpectedly excited she was about this new chapter. But one night, he snapped. He held her hostage in their garage for hours before shooting her and then himself. A third friend of mine, someone I was also close to, died in yet another tragic way. She got drunk, passed out in her yard, and froze to death while her friends were inside the house. The same night, I had taken 9 grams of mushrooms, smoked a blunt, and passed out in my own backyard. I was outside for so long that when I finally woke up, I was so numb I thought I was dead. The trip lasted about 16 hours, and the entire time I was convinced I had crossed over. When the trip wore off, I found out about my friend. She had died the very same way I thought I had. All 3 deaths happened within a year or two, and we were all part of the same circles. To this day, I still think about how close I came, how strange it was to survive while they didn't, and how fragile everything really is. Story 33. Back in 2011, my parents bought a little farm in the middle of nowhere. My dad was still working out of state, so it was just my mom and me in the new house. The place was at the end of a dead-end gravel road, surrounded by woods. Moving from the city to that isolated spot was unsettling enough, but what happened made it worse. One night, sometime after 10, there was a knock at the door. Our dog, a protective Australian shepherd, went wild. My mom grabbed her handgun and kept it hidden behind her back as I tried to hold the dog. At the door was a man claiming to be our neighbor, saying he wanted to welcome us at 10 at night. My mom tried to end the conversation, but he stopped her from closing the door. The dog was losing its mind, and the man started insisting that part of our land and even the well belonged to him. My mom told him to leave, but he refused. Calmly, she pulled the gun into view and said, "You leave now, or I'm going to shoot you and let my dog finish the job." He bolted, screaming, and ran down the driveway. That was when we realized he had not come alone. He shouted to someone else, "The woman has a gun," before driving off. We called the police, and luckily a deputy nearby stopped them before they left the private road. The man turned out to really be a neighbor who owned the adjacent empty lot. He did not live there. He only camped on it occasionally. He was given a trespass warning. It was one of the scariest nights of my life, but my mom's composure and readiness to protect us kept us safe. Story 34. The story of Mary Vincent is one of the most horrifying survival stories ever told. In 1978, she was hitchhiking in Central California when she was picked up by a man named Lawrence Singleton. At first, he seemed like just another driver willing to give her a lift, but soon everything changed. Singleton pulled over under the pretense of needing to relieve himself. When Mary stepped out as well, he struck her over the head and tied her up in the back of his van. He repeatedly assaulted her before committing a monstrous act. He cut off both of her arms below the elbows and threw her, naked and bleeding, down an embankment. On a lonely highway with little traffic, Mary did the unthinkable to survive. She packed her wounds with dirt to slow the bleeding and climbed a 30-foot embankment. The first car to pass sped away, terrified, but the second, a honeymooning couple who had taken a wrong turn, stopped and rushed her to the nearest hospital. Against all odds, she survived and went on to testify against Singleton in court. Shockingly, he received only 14 years in prison and served just 8 for good behavior. The outrage from Mary's case led to tougher sentencing laws for crimes involving torture, ensuring violent offenders could not be released early. After his release, no community would allow him to live there, so he ended up serving his parole on the grounds of San Quentin. Later, he moved to Florida. There, he killed a woman named Roxanne Hayes. This time, Mary testified again, ensuring that he faced the maximum penalty. He was sentenced to death but died of cancer in 2001. Mary Vincent went on to rebuild her life in Washington state. She raised 2 sons and became an artist, even creating prosthetic limbs for herself. Though she has lived with unimaginable trauma, she embodies resilience and survival. Story 35. I do not know if this story was ever in the papers, but it is something my dad told us, and it has never left me. One day, my father, who was an alcoholic and often sympathetic toward drifters, brought home a hitchhiker. He wanted my mom to give him food and wash his clothes. The man seemed off from the start, creepy in a way that was hard to explain. He ate, drank with my dad, and left. But every time he came through the area, he would stop by again. One night, after drinking heavily with my father, he confessed something chilling. He claimed he had killed his wife and later a girlfriend, burying them both beneath the kitchen of his house. He said he was on the run from the law. That confession sobered my dad instantly. He told the man to leave, then told my mom to take me and my sister to our grandparents until he said it was safe to come home. My dad called the police, but the hitchhiker disappeared before they arrived. Supposedly, he was eventually caught near Amarillo, Texas, though I could never find any record of it. I was about 4 at the time, but I remember my dad taking us to my grandparents, and along the way we stopped at a small pancake restaurant, something we never did. It stuck in my memory as the only time we ever ate out like that as a family. Despite this encounter, my dad did not stop picking up hitchhikers right away. Some even came to holiday barbecues, though my sister and I were never allowed near them without a parent watching closely. Eventually, when I was a teenager, my dad finally stopped bringing strangers home. Looking back, it still chills me to think that a confessed killer once sat in our kitchen, eating at our table. Story 36. The scariest thing I have ever experienced was watching my girlfriend, now my wife, die in front of me multiple times. Ghost stories I have had over the years are nothing compared to this. It seemed like a normal Sunday night. We had a couple of drinks, went to bed, and everything felt fine. We had been dating for a couple of years and shared the house with a roommate I had known for 25 years. Nothing seemed unusual until around 5 in the morning when I woke up and realized she was not breathing normally. She would not respond to me. I called 911 immediately. The paramedics arrived almost instantly, but right before they got there, she stopped breathing altogether. They started working on her, using the paddles. She came back a couple of times but was incoherent, alive but barely. I was completely clueless about what was happening, and the blood tests and medical questioning blurred together in my shock. She survived, but recovery was agonizing. For months, she struggled to regain her motor functions. Doctors told us to expect permanent brain damage. At one point, my mother-in-law looked me in the eye and said she probably would never come back fully, and I had to nod, fearing she was right. But slowly, against all odds, she recovered. Today, she is perfectly normal, with a successful career, showing no lasting effects aside from the bald spot where the paddles shocked her head, a mark that has since faded away. She jokes that marrying me might be her only lasting side effect. But I will never forget the terror of that night, holding her hand, not knowing if she would take another breath.